Misfits, outcasts, mutants. My dream, my vision, is for humans and mutants to coexist in peace and prosperity. But rather than being accepted for who they are, mutants are feared and oppressed. But here, with Cerebro, I can find them and teach them to use their abilities for good. Humankind is evolving, and these are the stories of that evolution. For 60 years, you've read their tales, and tonight, we celebrate them. To me, my X-Men.
In July 1963, Marvel published the X-Men #1. Coming from the creative minds of Marvel legends Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the book featured a superhero team unlike any other at the time. Young heroes, born different, seen as outcasts, bravely willing to defend the same human population who so often hated and feared them. As new creators and new characters built the mutant mythos, X-Men would become the hottest comic around. Joining me to talk about these first giant-sized decades of X are some truly legendary Marvel Comics creators. Please welcome Louise Simonson, writer and editor of numerous X titles, including X Factor, New Mutants, Uncanny X-Men, Wolverine, and more. Walter Simonson, writer and artist whose work spans the Marvel Universe, including X Factor and more. And Chris Claremont, X-Men writer since 1975 and currently writing Extreme X-Men. Chris, we're going to start with you. You, of course, come onto the X-Men with number 94. And at the beginning of the all-new, all-different era in 1975, after Giant Size comes out, what were your expectations, your hopes, your perspectives on the X-Men?
That it would last an issue or two?
Just as simple as that? Did you want to create a whole world that you eventually did, or you just wanted to just get it off the ground?
No, I mean, I wanted to work with Dave Cockrum. Len Wein, who had written Giant Size 1, was teamed up with one of the great character designers and storytellers of that and any era. And since when Len gave it up at the end of Giant Size 1, I basically tackled him and said, I want this book. And I wanted it because the characters were great, visually great, they were interesting, and the chance to work with Dave was utterly irresistible.
What was your reaction to the first piece of art you got from Dave?
I want to see the next page. This is great.
That's a good time. Louise, what was your first editorial assignment when you came to Marvel?
My first editorial assignment was any licensed book that Marvel produced. It was, I mean, I also did Man-Thing, which Chris was writing. That was given to me immediately. And I was promised the X-Men, but they needed to finish up the saga they were working on before I was actually allowed to take it, which I got it a little prematurely, and I was so lucky. I loved Chris's stuff. I was so excited to work with Chris.
Aside from working with Chris, what did you know of the X-Men before you joined the X-Men team as it was?
You know, I had read it off and on. I had not read it religiously because, you know, I was working at another company and producing comics for them. And, you know, you kind of pay attention there instead of to the fun stuff. But honestly, once I knew I was getting X-Men, I got these, they had all of the collections of X-Men that they had sort of glued into these volumes. And I brought the volumes home and I started reading them. I lived in Manhattan at the time, and I lived in an apartment, and there was a a big party, a loud party going on next door, and I had a headache, and I started reading those books, and it all went away. It was like you just fell into that world. It's a wonderful comic. It was a wonderful comic, and I hoped I didn't mess it up. Being involved.
Four pretty great years on X-Men. I'll be honest, it's good times. We'll keep coming back around, but Walter, I wanted to ask you, had you read any of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's X-Men when you were younger?
I had. I was actually in college when I discovered Marvel. So this would have been about 1965, at the end of my freshman year. I will say I picked up Thor originally, first one I saw on the newsstand. I read it, and within 3 months, I was buying all the Marvel comics that they produced. Now, back then, that was like 11 titles at about 20 cents a piece. So even a poor college student could afford to buy them all. But I read them, including X-Men. And then that was what, 65? I was in comics professionally by 72 and began working at Marvel in 74, a little after that. And, but I followed a lot of that stuff. I saw the new X-Men when they were reborn by Len and then Chris, and really enjoyed it. So I had kept track of it, and I had some idea of what had gone before. I started a little bit after they'd begun, so it took me a while to backtrack to the really early issues. But the Jack Kirby stuff, I was started after that. But I really loved it. I enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed it even more when Chris was writing it.
Yeah. We've got a comment in here from Brev T, who says, I'm so happy right now. 3 of my favorite creators. These people are my childhood, which I think is a beautiful sentiment, and the stories that you all have created have been so important. I want to ask Walter to start, but I'd love to hear from all of you. What makes the X-Men different from other super teams?
A couple thoughts about that. One of them is simply that they're kind of a very specific tribe. I mean, every book has, like, the Fantastic Four as a family. The Avengers seem more like random guys that got together to fight Loki, and other team books were like that. The X-Men had their mutant hood as their unifying factor, and unlike other superheroes, they were feared by most people. I'm not sure why some of the other superheroes weren't feared, but they were not. That was the way books were written back in those days. There was a sense of altruism, and characters behaved properly with powerful ones, other than the bad guys. And you had such powerful bad guys, you needed superheroes to take them. There were evil mutants out there, and the mutants began. Professor X brought the team together to fight them. So they were both students, in a sense, learning to be a family. And at the same time, they were isolated from people in general because they were mutants. And that made them, I think, an even tighter-knit group. So that gave that and the sense of paranoia that Stan did a pretty decent job of writing in the early first run of the X-Men. That kind of stayed with them for a long time. And it sort of separated them out. Now, I'm not saying that being paranoid was wrong. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you're wrong. But they were really tightly bound in a way that other books, in a different way than other books were.
Sure. Chris, obviously, writing the X-Men for so many years, how do you look at it, at the X-Men being a super team, and sort of how are they different from others?
Well, I think spinning off of what Walter said, if you look at pretty much all other superheroes in the Marvel canon, with the exception perhaps of Spider-Man, they all derive from a totally altruistic and accepted, that's the essence of it, accepted platform. People who generally know who the FF are, they trust the FF. They know who the Avengers are, they trust the Avengers. The X-Men, the X-canon, I should say, men being a very specific time and a very specific place in history, it not so much. They'd come out and do something, but there'd always be this but at the end. Do we really trust them? They're creepy. Where did they come from? Well, something changed them. We don't know. They got born this way. And I mean, a lot of that came out of my own history as an immigrant. walking into a room and having a different accent, which I did as a kid, dressing differently, approaching things differently. You were very much aware of being an outsider. And that was both scary, and there was a feeling of anger in return. It's like, why are you like this? Why do you hate me? Why can't we be friends? Well, you're from somewhere else. Well, it's like, yeah, so. But that was what made it easy. That was the emotional foundation that was easy to translate into the book and evolve over the course of basically getting to know these characters and evolving them over time, giving them depth, giving them an individuality, and turning them as much as I could into people rather than objects.
Yeah. Louise, from the editorial perspective and also a writer perspective, how do you look at the X-Men as a team?
What I loved was the chosen family aspect. The fact that these were all people who were different and chose to be with other people who were the same as they were, only different, who had the same problems, and they chose to interact in such a positive way with each other, to help each other with their difficulties. I mean, that I kind of liked that part of it particularly, which was, it's this wonderful characterization that, we just talked about these people. These weren't comic book characters, they were people.
Yeah, very much so. Of course, the X-Men fans love an event. They love a crossover. You were all involved in various ways in Mutant Massacre, Fall of the Mutants, Inferno, and I think we readers, the thousands of folks who are watching right now, we often come back to these stories and reread them and reread them. But do the three of you remember any of the conversations or planning sessions for some of these events? Chris, start with you.
Biggest mistake we ever made.
Why is that?
Because it was a success. It was a huge success. And we thought the world would go back to the way it was before. And we would keep writing issues. And maybe a year or two down the line, we'd come up with another brilliant idea, and we'd maybe team up or not. And the problem was that the higher authority looked at the numbers, looked at the circumstances, and said, all the retailers and all the fans are saying, we want another one. So their reaction was, let's do it again. So we did it again, and it sold better. Mm-hmm. And for me, speaking as the writer at the time, it was incredibly frustrating because you would do this crossover, and the crossover would be brilliant. I mean, I'm sorry, encountering the Thor Frog was just wonderful. But you needed 2 or 3 issues to set it up. Then you need 2 or 3 issues to wind it down. And it became harder to do the individual issues that focused on the characters in and of themselves. It focused on a single issue story. I mean, I was taught by Stan, comics were single issue stories because the distribution wasn't good enough that you could guarantee a continued story. 2-part stories, okay, they've got to be good. 3-part stories, only if it's the coming of Galactus, and the end of the 3rd story had to set up the next one, which was great. I mean, if you look at Dark Phoenix, they're all 1 or 2-part stories. The arc is long, but the points of it are very specific and singular. To me, that was the way to do things. And then suddenly we were evolving in a totally different direction, which I totally understand. And it made a lot of sense. And let's face it, the 3 of us liked doing really good stories. It was a great challenge. But again, I'm conflicted because in the process, I think the risk is that of losing that what made the series special in the first place. And that's an ongoing, continuous challenge that, it was fun, but it kind of took over the bus, which again, as a reader, I felt was sad.
Understood. I get your perspective 100%. I freaking love them, and I think everybody does here. We've got love in the chat for Mutant Massacre, from Nikhil and a bunch of other folks. I would love to hear more of the perspectives from Walter and Louise, but we're running out of time, so I do want to get some more fan questions in here. We have Kelly L., who said, and I'll ask this one to you, Louise, if you could take one X-Men character out to dinner to cheers and chat with, who would it be?
Oh, golly Moses. Gee, I don't know. Maybe the Beast would be a really interesting person to talk to. Hank McCoy would be really interesting. Jean would be interesting, depending on what she was going through at any given time. That woman has an interesting life. Cyclops would be kind of interesting, but he's such an introvert that it maybe would be hard to get him to say anything. So I don't know. But
Walter, what about you?
Any of them would be interesting, actually.
Sure.
Well, I like all those, but maybe Wolverine. He would have some interesting stories.
Chris, you're shaking your head.
Walt beat me to it.
Fair.
Well, we'll take them out together.
That's a good dinner. Giovanni S. asks, how do you all feel to be involved with a series, a franchise that has had such a cultural impact on the industry and pop culture in general? That's obviously a very big question, but do you have that perspective to look back and see how the characters that you've all touched in so many various ways, how that's affected folks?
I feel very lucky that we've done. It's really wonderful when you go to a convention and you meet people who say that the stories that you've told have made a difference in their lives. It's very humbling because you're sitting there and you're just making stuff up and you're hoping that people will enjoy it, but you really are very lucky when it touches somebody's heart. And I hear that with the X-Men stories a lot, that it made some people's childhoods bearable, it sounds like. Just being able to sink into the stories.
Yeah. And I would say, comics was a much smaller business back in the day we were doing this stuff. The death of Jean Grey kind of propelled comics into, especially the X-Men, other comics went along with it, into kind of a higher stratosphere, and it began to become a different business. But in the old days, I have to tell you, I was just glad the checks cleared.
Well said. This has been amazing. A huge thank you to Chris Claremont, Louise Simonson, Walter Simonson for joining us. Give a wave to everyone watching, y'all. Thank you so much.